This sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher. Philosophy indeed has no other origin. Philosophy, literally love of wisdom in Greek, means the search for truth in all its forms, wherever it can be found. A search that is inspired by a feeling of curiosity and awe, a passion to learn new things for their own sake. I personally think that this describes the fundamental attitude of the Christian thinker, an open, curious, wonder-filled search for truth. And I think this attitude can be traced back to a group of thinkers who lived in the 500s BC in the Mediterranean world. They are sometimes called the Pre-Socratic philosophers because they came before Socrates, but this title does not do justice to their significance. They are often credited with shifting Western consciousness from a mythological view of the world to natural philosophy, the old word for what we today call science. I have found the words of one 20th century scientist to depict the importance of these philosophers and their basic stance in a compelling fashion. Carl Sagan, the astronomer who first popularized science through a TV show, says this: "We are, almost all of us, descended from people who responded to the dangers of existence by inventing stories about unpredictable or disgruntled deities. Gods ran nature. Nothing could happen without their direct intervention. If they were happy, there was plenty of food and humans were happy. But if something displeased the gods, the consequences were awesome. Droughts, storms, wars, earthquakes, volcanoes, epidemics. There were gods of the sky and earth, the thunderstorm, the oceans, and the underworld. Seasons and harvests, fire and time, love and war. Where every tree and meadow had its dryad and maenad, an unpredictable nature run by capricious gods." Then, 2,500 years ago, there was a glorious awakening in Ionia, the coast of Turkey on the Mediterranean Sea. A new concept developed, one of the great ideas of the human species. The universe is knowable, the ancient Ionians argued, because it exhibits an internal order. There are regularities in nature that permit its secrets to be uncovered. Nature is not entirely unpredictable. There are rules even she must obey. The underlying harmony of the universe is accessible by observation and experiment. This ordered and admirable character of the universe is called cosmos. We will look briefly at 6 of these Ionian philosophers and their ideas. None of their original writings survive, but fragments were preserved by later writers such as Aristotle. Each of these men was searching for the arche, the basic underlying cause, or source, or principle from which everything in the cosmos comes, a kind of key to explaining the whole cosmos rationally. Some of their ideas seem pretty crazy to us today. Others are spot on with modern science. They do share with us concepts that will become key to understanding the history of Christian thought. Thales lived in Miletus in the early 6th century, 500s BC. Plato relates a funny story that a servant girl laughed at him for falling into a well while he was looking up at the stars. He was so eager to know things in the sky that he paid no attention to what was in front of him. He could be street smart when he wanted to, though. Once he used his knowledge of weather to predict that there would be a large olive crop. He leased all the olive presses in Miletus during the winter while they were cheap, then rented them out at harvest time when demand was very high, and made a big profit. In addition to meteorology, he studied astronomy and maths. He predicted an eclipse and identified the constellation we call the Little Bear, which contains the North Star and helps sailors to navigate, find their way on the open sea. Thales' big idea was that the arche of everything is water. Aristotle writes, "Most of the first philosophers thought that principles principles in the form of matter were the only principles of all things, for the original source of all existing things, that from which a thing first comes into being, and into which it is finally destroyed. The substance persisting but changing its qualities, this they declare is the element and first principle of existing things. Thales, the founder of this type of philosophy, says that it is water, and therefore he declared that the earth rests on water, perhaps taking the supposition from seeing the nutrition of all things to be moist, and the worm itself coming to be from this and living by this, taking the supposition both from this and from the seeds of all things having a moist nature, water being the natural principle of moist things. Let's unpack this quote. It is full of terms that we will continue to need. In the first half of the quote, Aristotle explains what he thinks Thales meant by arche, here translated principle, the stuff out of which everything is made. Just as gingerbread cookie dough can become any cookie, so there must be some primordial matter, physical, tangible stuff, out of which everything is made. Rocks, trees, people, cockroaches, clouds, fire, galaxies. The process by which the stuff becomes a thing, the cookie dough turns into a cookie, is called gignetai, here translated, comes into being. So individual things come and go. They are born and start to exist. They last for a while, then they die or break up and stop existing. But the arche, the stuff they are made out of, lasts. This is what Aristotle means by the substance, ousia, persisting but changing its qualities. So the substance is the unchanging reality that underlies all the changes. I can smush my cookie dough snowman and make a tree out of the dough. The substance does not change, but the qualities, the shape, and the decoration change. These three terms, arche, gignetai, and ousia, are important to remember for future reference. So, for Thales, the basic arche, or cookie dough of the universe, was water, and Aristotle explains why Thales thought that. From observation, everything needs water to live, and all observable living things have water in them. The process of decay, when moisture is present, generates heat. Sperm, the beginnings of mammalian life, is moist. And Thales also thought that there was water underneath land masses, and the shifting of the water explains earthquakes. Although to modern physics, Thales' theory of water is untenable, the method of thought that he used, close observation and inference, is the basic foundation of scientific method. While Carl Sagan saw a contrast or contradiction between the old myths and the new Ionian insights, other commentators see continuity. The ideas of Ionian philosophers grew out of ancient mythical creation stories, took them seriously, and tried to explain them. For Thales, this may be closer to the truth. In addition to observations of the natural world, he may have been inspired by a variety of ancient cosmogonic myths from Africa, Asia, and Greece that portray water deities as primordial agents of creation. He also tried to include the divine in his understanding of the physical universe, saying that all things are full of gods, although his exact meaning here can be debated. Two more Ionian thinkers from Miletus, Anaximenes and Anaximander, here shown holding a sundial which he is sometimes credited with inventing, had similar views to Thales. For Anaximenes, however, the arche, the basic stuff, was not water, but air. He recognized how gases can condense into liquids and even solids, and how changes in atmospheric density and pressure cause various changes in the weather. Anaximander began, just a bit, to leave behind the assumption that the arche had to be matter, something tangible or physical. He called it the apeiron, the indefinite or undefined. It resembled no one kind of matter in the developed world. With Anaximander, philosophers begin moving toward a more metaphysical view of the cosmos. Heraclitus, scary looking in this 18th century sculpture, lived in Ephesus in the late 500s BC. Lots of strange anecdotes, probably fake, surround him. Diogenes Laertius tells us that he became a misanthrope, people hater, withdrew from the world, and lived in the mountains eating grasses and plants. He wrote in riddle-like aphorisms, short sayings, the most famous being, "You can't step into the same river twice, for different waters are always flowing upon you." Heraclitus emphasized that everything in the world changes. Nothing is permanent. There's no one physical substance or entity that always stays the same, and each thing eventually changes into its opposite, dry into wet, cold into hot, young into old, war into peace. Yet, under all this change, there is an underlying coherence, a formula or pattern of arrangement that all things share. He called this the Logos, or Word. All things happen according to the Logos. Although the Logos is common, meaning shared, the many live as though they had a private understanding. Listening not to me, but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. Some scholars think that Logos for Heraclitus had the sense of measure, reckoning, or mathematical proportion, an arrangement according to a plan that is in all things. Heraclitus spoke of God in a similar way, as a unifying principle which connects opposites. God is day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, hunger. God undergoes alteration in the way that fire, when it is mixed with spices, is named according to the scent of each of them. The term logos passed into the thought of later philosophers, including the Stoics, and became important to Christians. We have seen how it appears in the beginning of the Gospel of John, and we will see it again in later writers who wrestle with the question, who is God? Our last two Ionian philosophers, Pythagoras and Democritus, come closest to what we would call scientific in their outlook. Pythagoras lived on the island of Samos off the coast of Ionia. He did not write anything, but he had followers, Pythagoreans, who preserved his teachings and added their own, and spread their influence into Italy. The Pythagoreans viewed philosophy as a way of life, not just a set of ideas, and they observed personal rules such as not eating beans or sacred animals. Some believed in reincarnation. After death, a person's psyche, soul, mind, or self, can enter into another body. Others thought that some souls could attain a happy, immortal life after death. Today, people tend to take the idea of an immortal soul for granted in U.S. culture. Although not everyone believes in it, the idea is widespread, mostly because of Christianity. This idea, however, of the soul being something separate from the body, outliving the body and experiencing an immortal afterlife, was not originally biblical. New Testament texts emphasize hope in the resurrection of both soul and body, people rising from their graves to appear before Christ at the end of history. The idea of a deathless psyche was imported into Christian thought from the philosophies and cultures of the wider Mediterranean world. Pythagoras' big idea was that the arche of all things is number. All things are like number, he taught. Everything that happens in the world, Pythagoreans observed, can be explained through mathematical relationships. They discovered that musical intervals, the set of notes that make up all music, are based on numerical ratios. 2 to 1, cutting a guitar string in half, for example, gives the octave. 3 to 2 gives the perfect fifth. 4 to 3, the perfect fourth, and so on. It turns out that every phenomenon in nature, as far as we know, behaves this way. Mathematical equations describe the movement of footballs, planets, and weather patterns. The interaction of chemicals, and even the behavior of large groups of people in the form of statistics. Modern sciences are based on this fundamental assumption. Like Heraclitus, Pythagoras shifted away from a material idea of the arche, like Thales' water, to a purely immaterial idea. This shift is important for understanding Christian thought. For Christians, God, the divine ousia, is utterly transcendent, completely beyond the physical, tangible world. Mediterranean philosophy laid the groundwork for this kind of thinking. The Greek philosopher Plato, whom you will study next, continued and solidified that shift, and handed on his ideas to the key Christian thinker Augustine, whom we will meet in a later chapter. Democritus of Abdera, however, went in the opposite direction. For him, and for his lesser-known predecessor Leucippus, matter is the only true reality. Their big idea was that everything around us is made up of indivisible particles. They called these particles, as you probably already know, atoms, from the Greek word atomos, not cuttable, inferring that if you had a perfectly sharp knife and unlimited time, you still couldn't go on cutting an item forever. At some point you'd bump into a bit you couldn't cut, and that would be the absolutely most basic part. These parts, because of their shapes, can stick together when they bump into each other to form objects. There is an infinite number of these particles, and they are invisible because of the smallness of the particles. They move in the void, a vacuum or empty space, and when they come together they cause coming to be, and when they separate they cause perishing. When they are compounded and entangled, they create something. Democritus realized that if atoms are the only things that are truly real, then our senses deceive us. Things may seem to us to be sweet or bitter, hot or cold, but those are just names that we give to our sensations. In reality, there are only atoms interacting with each other. The same is true with our thoughts and feelings. These are movements of the atoms that make up our soul. And so, to achieve well-being, quote, good spirits, we need to seek moderate pleasures and avoid drama that stirs up the soul. Democritus' influence on philosophy was profound. After him, Epicurus and the Roman writer Lucretius would spin out further the implications of Democritus' atomism for ethics, religion, and everyday life. Since even the soul is made up of atoms that scatter when the body dies, there is no afterlife. When you die, that's it. There are no gods, or if there are, they're distant beings who have nothing to do with us. Therefore we have nothing to fear, no divine punishments, no hell, and no worries. The only rules of life are to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. Not pleasure by overindulging, since that only brings pain later, but rather by living a simple life, with few wants and good friends. Democritus gave birth to a compelling and successful movement called Epicureanism that continues to gain adherents today. These ideas presented, and continue to present, a challenge to Christian thought. We have studied briefly the ideas of the Ionian philosophers, each of whom was seeking, in his own way, the one arche, the source, origin, cause, or principle of all things, and each of whom influenced the development of Christian thought, not only through their specific ideas, but also through their overall attitude of sincere search for truth.